Today's talk features the remarkable Harlem Renaissance writer Jean Toomer. Jean Toomer is an interesting figure because, in a sense, having read the autobiography of an ex-colored man, one has strange suspicion, although it's not, there's no warranting for it, that the life that is described of of the ex-colored man parallels in very interesting ways the life of Jean Toomer. Of course, Jean Toomer was born in 1891. By the time James Weldon Johnson was writing the autobiography, Jean Toomer hadn't emerged as a major writer until the publication of his book, Cain, in 1919. Toomer came from an interesting past. His father was an ex-slave of mixed heritage who married multiple women. He married several women before he finally married Jean Toomer's mother, and those marriages ended with the death of the wives. And he married largely mixed-race African Americans. In one instance, it was an ex-slave who he married, and in another instance, he married a woman whose father had been her owner, but eventually she was brought into the family, and she had received a major inheritance. So the father would have been expected to receive that inheritance. However, he didn't. She died. Finally, Jean Toomer's father married Jean Toomer's mother, a woman I think called Pitchfork, and had Jean Toomer, but very quickly after, within a few years, the father essentially abandoned them and moved back to Georgia. They were living in D.C. at the time. So essentially, Jean Toomer was raised in D.C. by his mother and by her extended family, who belonged to what we would call a mixed race class of middle class African Americans living in DC, many of them working in the civil service, and many of them having professional lives and so on. Jean Toomer had a quite elaborate educational experience. He studied in at least six different institutions, including the University of Chicago, NYU, school, I think the University of Wisconsin. He enrolled in many programs. He did sociology, he did history, he did exercise science, but he never completed a degree, which is very interesting. He kept reading a lot, taking classes and so on and so forth, but never completed a degree. Eventually, Jean Toomer would travel to the south to a place called Sparta, Georgia, at a time when, in the early 1910s, about 1912 or 1916 or 17, when many of the black communities were seeking teachers, educators. They were establishing historically black schools, and many African Americans went there for work. Jean Toomer happened to go down there and got a job teaching at one of these schools, and he didn't last very long. He was there for about half a year. And he left eventually because he couldn't take the pressure of it. But what came out of it, of course, was this book, Cain. It was while he was in Sparta that he started to write this book, Cain. And Cain had incredible success. Cain came about because he had been collecting all these stories, snippets, plays, poems, sketches of the South. And when he got back, he worked with a major American writer who he became friendly with called Waldo Frank. And Waldo Frank was very interested in Toomer's work, and he became the editor of this book, which became Cain. Cain was pitched and sold as a novel, but as you would see if you've read any of the pieces, the excerpts that we have of Cain in our anthology in the Norton, you'll see that demarcation was a very, very specific to what one would call the high modern period of American writing, where the idea of what a novel constitutes is challenged and complicated by by what we will now call a multi-genre text, a hybrid text. So this work would include a novella called Cabness, which ends it. It's in three parts. The first part would be a series of sketches, largely focusing on African American women from the South, and looking at their lives, their sexuality, and their experiences in that context. The second part will be set in D.C., in city in D.C., and there are several stories that are set there. And then all the three parts are interspersed with short poems, very interesting symbolic poems. And in some of these poems, he's writing about the South, he's writing about racism in the South, he's writing about the Southern experience and the Southern spirit. And they form a kind of chorus, a chorus of landscape. For Toomer, the landscape of the South was a landscape where the South was almost like a woman. And he used that metaphor of the South as being a woman. And really, he was talking about the Black South, a woman that was abused, that was damaged, that was hurt, but also that had developed a kind of defiance and a strength, and a kind of attitude that many of the women that he describes in the work have. It also included, as I said, short stories, character sketches, and plays, whole sections that are whole scenes of plays, especially for in the DC section. And then the long novella in Cabness really goes back to the South, and then it's almost a syncretization where the South, North and South meet. And it tells the story of a man who is going down to the South to teach and witnesses, not unlike in James Weldon Johnson's autobiography of an ex-colored man, witnesses the abuses and the damages of Southern racism, the attack on the black person, and eventually he's not able to take it and he decides to leave. So then the question became, why is this called a novel? Typically, a novel, as you would know, has at least these elements. It has characters that are consistent all the way through, from the beginning to the end. It has a setting that may be consistent all the way through, although not necessarily so. But it has a narrative, a story, a plot that unfolds and follows an individual character all the way through the end. Kane has none of these things. Kane has a couple of recurring characters, but not really characters that appear all the way through. And the characters do not recur across the sections. Kane doesn't have a singular plot at all. So it has various snippets, sketches, and moments that do not necessarily have a rigid connection, certainly in terms of narrative. But there's a symbolic structure to Kane that connects it all. One is the dialectic triad of the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, where there's a sense in which you've got the South, the North, and then the synthesis of the South and North. The construction of that is the poetic construction of that becomes one of the things that conjoins the work. Thematically, it looks at African American life, and so the African American life becomes part of the work. One could argue that thematically, the central character for these works, especially for the first two sections, is the South. It's the land, or is the idea of the Negro in that regard. Now, we will get into some more detail about the text itself, because it will be useful for us to think about it. But one of the things that is worth paying attention to is Jean Toomer's disposition towards his work. Jean Toomer was very early on reluctant to have the work described as being written by a Negro artist. He had an antipathy to the idea of being called a Negro or being called black. In many ways, I think he considered it a kind of restriction. He very early on in his life began to describe himself as American. and therefore not was never comfortable with the being demarked as an African American. However, what is evident is that Jean Toomer was, according to various years of the census, their census was taken in 1900 when he was a child, and then in the 1920s when he was an adult. That indicated that he was a Negro. He was identified as a Negro. 1930 and 1935, he was identified as white. 1940, when he was drafted, he volunteered as a draftee for the Second World War. He was identified as a Negro, um, and so on and so forth. And of course, when he died, his death certificate identified him as white. Interestingly, Jean Toomer got married a few times. Um, and he married white women. The first time he got married, he married a white woman who was a writer, a very successful writer, and then she died in childbirth. The marriage was controversial. Time magazine went to interview them about the marriage because, of course, this idea of intermarriage, which was called miscegenation, was illegal in many places in the United States. And so that was controversial. And then later on, he would not marry another white woman, a Jewish American woman of some wealth, who he was with for the rest of his life. But again, he clearly sought to position himself not explicitly as black. I suppose if you remember in the autobiography of the ex-colored man, he does state at some point that he would not declare himself white, but he would shave his mustache. He said, he would grow a mustache, and then he would allow people to take him as he is. And so I think Jean Toomer's attitude was, don't ask, don't tell. If he would not, if the censor takers came and looked at him and presumed him to be white, by his look, by where he lived, by his wife, by who he was among, he would not challenge it, and he would not say he is not white. Pictures of Jean Toomer show that he looked like he could pass, and I think there's evidence that he spent a lot of time passing as white. But of course, this idea that he was passing and this idea that he was in fact a black man is a very American sort of preoccupation, and in some ways a piece of a relic of slave society and slavery. Jean Toomer was by most standards and sort of by any examination of his historical past and his ancestral past, was predominantly European. Maybe 80 to 90% European. He had some black blood in him, but not a significant amount. And yet he was classified as a black person, and he was to be seen as a black person in the one-drop tradition of American life. Jean Toomer would write other works, but Cain would be the one that gained the greatest success, reputation, and strength. And his other works became quite different because they didn't focus on African American experience in the way that Cain did. And one of the reasons why Waldo Frank decided to identify in the introduction that this was the work of a Negro artist was because in 1919, when the book came out, 1919 was a very volatile time. Lots of riots against blacks, lots of protests by blacks. This was a time when Marcus Garvey with the UNIA was marching, the largest black organization in the world, was protesting, marching, and seeking to create a situation where they would repatriate African Americans to Africa and speaking against racism in America. This was a very, very lively and volatile time, and there was a definite interest in seeing emerging African American writers. In an essay that we're going to talk about this week, called The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain by Langston Hughes, Langston Hughes talks about Jean Toomer. He names Jean Toomer along with Paul Robeson, along with Bessie Smith, as the great African American artists of the Harlem Renaissance that were changing and transforming American life and doing something quite radical and quite different. So when we get back, we'll start talking a little bit about the pieces in Jean Toomer's Cane. Now the depending on what edition of the Norton that you have, you may have only excerpts from Kane. I think in one edition there's only the cabinet section, and in another edition you may have the full all the stories in Kane. But what we will do is the comments that I will make will help to frame the way that we can approach Kane and think about Kane, largely as a work that was a high modernist work and one of the few works that one could say by African Americans that departed from a certain kind of well, I shouldn't say departed from, but that seemed to be consistent with the emerging modernist writers, including Faulkner, including T.S. Eliot, including Virginia Woolf, and certainly including somebody like James Joyce. And these were writers who were literally changing the idea of the novel and the concept of the novel. While Toomer didn't get enough credit as a modernist, and that was racist, that was because he was black, and therefore not read in that kind of way, but only read critically in sociological ways rather than in literary ways. He was certainly writing within that vein, and he was reading all of these writers and was drawing his ideas about what he was trying to do from them. But we'll pick this up in the next section.